Over the last 2 years, the pandemic exposed the intersections of multiple structures of inequality, including race, ethnicity, gender, and class, which have a multiplying, devastating effect when they intersect in the same individual. Intersectionality, a term coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, refers to this phenomenon, how systems of oppression overlap to create distinct experiences for people with multiple identity categories. This podcast explores intersectionality in the context of immigrant criminalization. It illustrates how issues of immigration and criminalization do not operate in silos, but actively work in tandem with race, class, and gender to compound its harmful impacts such as incarceration, deportation, family separation, and deep trauma. Given the state of the world and how people most marginalized experience it, using an intersectional lens in philanthropy is critical to adequately addressing issues for true outcome and impact. It challenges us to think outside of programmatic silos and helps us to deepen our analysis of the problems we are trying to address. The very conception of a problem determines whether or not a prescribed intervention will or will not address the multiple ways that people experience an issue or harm. Importantly, this analysis requires a focus of people and not just issues. We must see people as their true selves and understand their experiences and the overlapping inequalities that they face. This is all tied to the importance of a trust-based philanthropic approach. Shifting power to and building mutual accountable relationships with people directly impacted on the ground has more lasting and transformative impacts than transactional traditional funder-grantee relationships, where people are forced into programmatic boxes. Hello, my name is Erin Talbert Brust, and I'm a communications officer at the Heising-Simons Foundation. Today we are joined by 3 leaders in the fight against criminalization and immigration systems in California. So I now will turn it over to them to introduce themselves and how they personally came into understanding the intersectionality between immigration and criminalization. So let's turn to the movement work. Guerline, would you mind introducing yourself?
My name is Guerline Jozef. I am the co-founder and executive director of the Haitian Alliance, the Black Immigrants Bell Fund, and the Cameroonian Advocacy Network. I came into this work looking into how the criminal system is impacting immigrants in California and across the country, but focusing on Black immigrants, understanding that the overpolicing of our communities, the pipeline from school to prison, from communities to ICE detention, and from ICE detention to deportation. We can really look into the anti-Black racism that is at the root of the many systems here in the United States. That includes immigration, and that includes people at the US-Mexico border. We all saw in September of last year, September 2021, how the treatment of Black migrants in Del Rio, Texas, was center stage in the media. That was one of the very real times that people were able to see what we at the Haitian Alliance, along with many other Black-led organizations, have been highlighting and literally telling people for a very long time. And we can look into history all the way back to the 1970s, 1980s, with the arrival of Black immigrants from Haiti, Black refugees from Haiti, and how they were treated and put in immigration detentions and kept in Guantanamo Bay and returned back to Haiti in the middle of turmoils. We can look into what's been happening right now. Currently, to date, under current president, 20,000 people have been sent to Haiti in less than a year. That includes pregnant women, children as young as just a few days old. For me, I can go back personally. You know, I am a Black immigrant. I woke up this morning as a Black woman. I woke up this morning as an immigrant woman. So for me, I cannot detach, I cannot remove one from the other. When we say immigration is a Black issue, that's exactly what it means. Also for me, the first time that I came face to face to the reality of racism in the United States was when Abner Louima, who is a Haitian man who was extremely, extremely abused by NYPD. And my father at the time took me to visit him. And as part of the delegation that included Michael Jackson and Stevie Wonders and my dad, myself, and a few other people, that was the first time I came face to face to the reality of the brutality of what can happen to a Black person in the United States, whether you were born here or came from a country like Haiti. Once you are here, the worth of anti-Black racism was upon you, upon your body. And I remember really looking at Abner Louima completely disfigured. I mean, what they did to him is unexplainable. And I don't know if people can go back and really remember and see that. And for me, at the same time, was able to connect that with Emmett Till. When his mother said, let them see, open the casket so people can see, because we really understood that in order for the stories of Black people in America to be believed, it had to be seen. And so that was the main connection for me as to how, as an immigrant who was very privileged, comparing to people who are currently at the US Mexico border, who made that journey in search of freedom and liberty, in refuge and protection. I was privileged to get on a plane and come to New York, but quickly understood as a very young person the reality that as a Black person, as a Black woman, as an immigrant, I was also a part of the Black community in America and could not escape the anti-Black racism and the abuse that could happen to any of us at any time.
My name is Lian Cheun. I'm the Executive Director at Khmer Girls in Action. We are a youth organizing organization based in Long Beach, California. We also do youth advocacy and leadership development, and I'm very happy to be here today. My family and I were resettled in East Oakland in the mid-'80s. And like many Southeast Asian refugees, we were resettled in impoverished urban neighborhoods and in Black and Brown communities that have historically been disinvested in and oftentimes with fragile infrastructure. I remember the housing project that I grew up in and the constant police sirens. The legacy of the genocidal horrors of the Khmer Rouge was also transported to resettled communities like Oakland, like Philly, like Long Beach, manifesting in higher levels of violence. And there were just many levels of violence growing up, in Oakland. Like I witnessed so many of those, the violence of poverty, domestic violence, violence of attending poorly resourced and overcrowded schools, gang violence, the violence of living in heavily policed neighborhoods. And community of colors have historically lived within these conditions. Cambodians were people who were displaced by US carpet bombing during the Vietnam War, who survived a genocide. When we got resettled, we were resettled in some of the most violent, impoverished neighborhoods impacted by mass incarceration and the war on drugs. And the resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees into these conditions with little to no mental health support led to disproportionately higher rates of incarceration. I remember when I was growing up, the compounding traumas of all of this often felt, too much to bear for many of our community members. I remember family and friends struggling with PTSD and just really numbing themselves with alcohol and drugs and getting caught up, really trying to numb their pain, trying to survive in the streets, and oftentimes landing in prison. There has just been so much loss in our community. My generation in particular, the 1.5 generation, was the most severely impacted. This generation of refugee youth were in our teens when some of the harshest sentencing laws were passed. We have elders saying that, we left the killing fields just to see our children being killed on the streets in America and getting locked up and sent away. Cambodians and other Southeast Asians have been targeted for deportation because of past criminal convictions. And as of last year, more than 15,000 people have final orders of removal to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And the deportations are tearing our families apart again. All of these experiences continue to leave deep wounds and trauma in me, in the Cambodian community, and in other Southeast Asian families. So, as a young person, when I was growing up in Oakland in the 90s, I saw how systemic and institutional racism impacted my community, my schools, my friends, and families. And I was trying to understand all of these dynamics. I just remember how hard it was as a teenager trying to understand and navigate these challenges.
My name is Sandy Valenciano, and I am the Campaigns and Organizing Director with Urban Peace Movement. I identify as an undocumented brown woman in the space, and a pleasure to be with you all. I think about my personal and own experience growing up with a light-skinned brown mother and an Afro-Latino father. My father would often be pulled over by the police and have cars confiscated for having a lack of driver's license. This didn't mean that my father wasn't driving safe or, that there was anything that he could have done in his power to not be pulled over. But my father had this experience simply because he was an Afro-Latino man. And what he looked like made him a higher target for police and policing in our community and in our neighborhood. So the experiences of my father being criminalized and policed compared to my mother were very different. Even though we were part of the same economic class, even though we were all undocumented, my father's experience has been very different than the rest of my family. This then created challenges within the relationship between my mother and my father, where my mother would then blame my father for putting us in a position that unfortunately my father had no power and no control over. And these experiences early on in my childhood really helped shape my perspective, and it brought up a lot of questions that thankfully being connected to organizing of movement work really put things into context for me. I always share with folks that I would always be full of rage thinking that why does my family have so much bad luck? Why us? And what I was really grasping and coming to terms with was that my family was being oppressed. And in particular, my father was experiencing anti-Blackness. What many people don't know is that ICE heavily relies on local police departments to funnel our people into their custody. This means that for many folks, ICE, La Migra, is the police. And many people have many different experiences with this within the Latinx community.
Intersectionality is a term that comes up a lot in social justice work. It comes up when community groups are trying to describe how policies and systems affect multiple people's identity, but is also a practice that they are often unable to act upon due to challenges organizations face when they are competing for limited funding.
We work to develop socially conscious and politically active youth in our community. And our mission is to build a progressive and sustainable Long Beach community that works for gender, racial, and economic justice, led by Southeast Asian young women. And we want a safe and healthy and just world for all people. And we want all of our community to be able to determine our lives and the direction of our lives. And in order to realize all that, we must lean into an intersectional approach. So, in a lot of our work, we do a lot of movement building with young people and their family and other youth of color in Long Beach. We have done work that is related to school climate, as well as work to support and decriminalize young people in our community, here locally in our city, as well as at a county level. We also really believe in supporting and advancing young people's rights as well as investing in young people's future, particularly for youth of color, and being able to center young people's voices in shaping that, in shaping what that looked like, in building power and allowing them to center their needs and the needs of their family. And oftentimes when we look at, our work and the intersectional approach is really thinking about who we are, where we grow up, and our collective community as whole people, and that we're not compartmentalized into different parts of who we are, but we are collectively whole. And all of us are the many different things that are happening in the communities. For a lot of the youth that we work with that grew up in Central Long Beach, that's one of the low income neighborhoods in Long Beach that have some of the highest working class family, highest rental burden in the city of Long Beach. It's a very Black, Brown, and Southeast Asian community. And so young people grow up together, they go to school together, and they see a lot of the same issues that are impacting them and their peers. And so it's very hard to disconnect all that when you see all of that is actually being linked together. And I think young people really see that because they grow up together with each other. And also, many times they are less jaded than some of the adults in the community. So they're inspired and excited about posing solutions together. And I think when the pandemic hit and with the national interests, because there was so many political flashpoints in the last several years with what happened with George Floyd, with all the challenges that we have seen emerging from the pandemic, there's been just a lot of solidarity and racial justice solidarity, as well as a lot of the gender justice solidarity that we see in our young people, really being able to center and name Black Lives Matter, and that we are here for each other. We're here to take care of each other, and we're here to be in solidarity with each other. Because a lot of the safety and the security of our community require all of us and all of us to be in this together. And so I have been super inspired by young people, by the youth in our community coming together and being there for each other and showing up for each other. And that has been super important. And, to do that both on kind of like the physical level, of the showing up for each other, whether it be, taking action together, bringing our cultural piece. A lot of them love doing poetry and art and really bringing some of those conversation into the school, into the home, into the community level to help build solidarity.
In order for funders to truly lean into intersectionality, we need to trust our partners. This includes developing a trust-based model for funding that requires philanthropy to forge a new relationship with communities of color. Organizations run by leaders like Guerline, Lian, and Sandy are just 3 examples of why foundations need to be more supportive and trusting of the work that organizations are doing for impacted communities and to build intersectional transformative agendas.
I can tell you the first 5 years, we received absolutely no funding. And when we are in communications with funders, they will say, we have been following you for a very long time, and we want to see how we can help. And we look into how for 5 years we've been struggling. For 5 years, we're having community members dealing with mental health, with anti-Black racism, but having to do it out of pocket. And really looking into how a trust-based relationship between those of us who are on the ground and a lot of our team members, staff members are impacted community members and unable to pay them because they just have to volunteer because we don't have the money, the funding to be able to answer to the needs of the community. I think when we are looking at Black and Brown communities, but specifically Black-led organization, women-led organization that have come to be out of a necessity, because there is nowhere else for people to get the support that they need. There's no other organization being able to address a cultural understanding, language access, mental wellness in a way that people can actually feel comfortable to receive the services that they desperately need, has been a struggle for us. And we are very grateful for California Endowment to be able to join us in this fight now. But we needed that 6 years ago. And we needed to build that reality. We needed to highlight the need of Black immigrants at the US-Mexico border that is not normally in the media, because when we talk about immigration, we don't see the Black community. And as Cindy mentioned, we don't see the Afro-Latinx community. We don't see the people who are Garifuna, the Afro-Colombians. We don't see them being a part of what we are trying to do. With funding comes a box that you have to be in this box in order for you to continue to get this funding. It doesn't work for us because we have to be able to be flexible, because we are working with a very fluid system. Today, if a new rule comes out, we have to respond to that. So we're really looking into this trust relationship between our funders and supporters and the communities that we serve.
When I reflect on when, the work that I have led has been most impactful, I always also reflect on how in the moments when I've had this strong partnership with funders, how much more impact I was able to make in that work. One clear example that comes to mind is at the peak of the Abolish ICE movement, a lot of people were not behind that narrative, right? And behind that ask. And I remember the opportunity that a funder gave me where we came in and we actually broke down like what we mean when we say abolish ICE, and how that allowed them to convey to other partners, this is what it means. And it is our responsibility to take the time to understand what these demands mean much deeper than at the surface. And I remember how that also impacted the way that we talked about abolition in migrant justice spaces, and how that then created more of a entry point and intersection of where this divestment and investment framework lives and how expansive it could be.
Having heard from our movement leaders and understanding that there are many layers that are needed to solve the problem of more foundations adapting a trust-based model, what is evident is that grantees have been telling funders what they needed from them to do the work for decades, but have been defeated time and time again since philanthropy has a history of not trusting communities of color. Within a sector that is comprised of extreme wealth that trickles down to the hands of a few, in order to truly make an impact, we must trust them instead of creating hurdles for them to do the work.
My name is Angie Junck, and I am the first Human Rights Director at the Heising-Simons Foundation. And prior to that, I was a grantee of the foundation.
And I'm Sandy Chiang, Senior Program Manager at the California Endowment.
My journey into philanthropy was kind of by happenstance, honestly. I spent many of the years that I was in the movement fundraising, and I had to fundraise at this intersection of criminal justice and immigration that our speakers spoke about. And it was so frustrating. I mean, I think there were so many more shut doors than open doors. And that dominant experience, outside of a couple of national funders that were really amazing and supportive, however, was, really a consistent denial of funding on the basis that Either the work was seen squarely as an immigration issue, not a criminal legal issue. Even though we know immigrants are being treated disparately in the criminal legal system and facing extra consequences in the form of permanent deportation from the United States. And then, others would just say the work was too criminal legal focused and it's not palatable for the immigrant justice movement. And what I heard loud and clear was no one wants to support, quote, bad immigrants. And because philanthropy really sees these issues through the lenses of like either criminal legal or immigration and not looking at the people's stories, the stories of the people that I knew that were facing deportation, it really erased the BIPOC immigrant experience. And it was frustrating because I felt like philanthropy was thinking that they were solving this issue, but it was really seeing that this immigrants' experience was being exacerbated and by denying their actual human experience. And we knew that these systems of oppression were working in tandem with one another, and yet it was being ignored in terms of the support that this work needed.
I stepped into the work in Santa Ana in 2014. And, I remember when we launched the initiative, what we asked all of our partners to do was to prioritize these 10 outcomes that we had pre-populated for them. We said, okay, here are the priorities, here are the outcomes we want you guys to be working towards. But you could go ahead and prioritize 3 to 5 of these that you think are most important for you to work on in the first 3 to 5 years of this 10-year initiative. We did not have anything around immigration. And so when I stepped into Santa Ana in 2014, the people of Santa Ana, because we asked the community to prioritize these outcomes, and they said, there's no immigration here. And the California Endowment actually said, no, we don't do immigration. It's a federal issue. We don't do immigration. And again, to the credit of the people of Santa Ana, they said, no, we're going to put it on our priority anyway. It actually doesn't matter if TCE funds it. We're just going to put it on there because that is our reality. And that was my first introduction into kind of that intersection point that you're talking about, Angie. And for years, I went in 2014. It wasn't until 2016, 2017 that I actually started to understand what the community was saying. They weren't saying that immigration was more important than this other issue. They're saying that immigration was the issue that threaded through every single aspect of their life. And so they couldn't separate it out. And so when I asked them, what work are you doing? They would say immigration. I said, no, we can't put that down. TCE doesn't fund immigration. But they would teach me and they would talk to me about how integral immigration was when they were talking about school climate, when they were talking about housing, and when they were talking about the over-policing of their communities. We were in our sites 3 to 4 days a week having meetings. And because we were there with such frequency and because we were expected to show up, not because we were the funder, but because we really wanted to learn aside our partners. We wanted to be in the community to really experience and hear and understand the things that they were telling us. We started to develop a really different relationship. We just developed a relationship where they started to see me as a thought partner. So they didn't look at me and just go, okay, there's money behind this person, even though there was, and I totally acknowledge that. But they actually would call me and say, hey, what are your thoughts about that? And when we started to develop that kind of relationship, that's when the conversation really started to change. And in doing so, I was able to show up in those conversations as a whole person. So not just Sandy Chiang, the program manager for the California Endowment, but Sandy Chiang, who also comes with this experience or that capacity, and bringing it into a thought partnership conversation where we're talking about strengthening the movement. In doing that, I also invited them to also come into those conversations as whole people, often which they were leaders of their organizations, yes, but they were also impacted people who are undocumented, who were struggling through everything that the community is struggling, but at the same time trying to lead the organization and able to fundraise and do all those other things that we know they have to do at the same time, which allowed me to go, you know what? You don't have to do the dog and pony dance with me anymore because I know where you're going. And even though it doesn't fit nicely within our funding priorities, I'm going to fund you because I believe in you. And let me figure out how to get the grant going on this end. And so it really started to model this idea of trust-based philanthropy in a very organic and relational way. But at the same time, it allowed us to start this process of really seeing what the potential was for trust-based philanthropy.
I think for me, having walked into philanthropy and thinking about the approaches to the work, one of the reasons why I chose to work at Heising-Simons Foundation was there was a deep connection with our board about the fact that people are just as important or more important than the issues themselves. And that starting point for me, I just knew that we could move in a way that actually fundamentally addressed the things that we were seeing in the world if we could start from that point. And so when you talk about trust-based philanthropy and how we want to be as funders, I think about relationships, and you talked about those relationships on the ground, and that's fundamentally about people and how do we empower, sustain, and care for them. For caring for the Sandys of the world, the Lians, the Guerlines that are fighting this fight for social justice in this country. And they are people that are closest to the problems and are fundamental to create and drive change. We are working on very dynamic issues, and they change all the time. And there's going to be campaign after campaign, but we have to sustain the people that are the driver behind this. And so for us, the path has been shorter. Sandy, we've benefited from work from foundations that have been doing this much longer, but we were able to jump into a place where we could develop a strategy that focused on people and building their power, building their capacity, and really keeping them at the constant center. And I think, from that point, it's really been about how do we relate to our grantees and how do we support them? If that really requires us leaning in and listening to them, that requires us to kind of constantly question and examine how we're showing up. And so like some of the things that I, have learned, and they may just seem obvious, but there is a lot of honesty and transparency that's involved on this side. There were so many conversations I had as a grantee with a funder. And even though I felt like I knew the funder for a long time and they had been funding the organization, there still sometimes was like I didn't know what was happening behind the scenes. And I think that made it difficult. It's hard to build trust when you don't feel like it's a two-way conversation, that there needs to be some vulnerability. And I will say that the two-way conversation is really incredibly important to me and to our program. We ask grantees to share all the time, but we don't really often share anything on our end. And like you said, you have to bring the Sandy Chiang whole in her person. We are human too. And, to the extent we can, we should share what we're grappling with. And we know we don't know everything, and we often don't have control over all of the decision, but that's okay. I think also just the patience, Sandy, you were there, you showed up, and it took time, and time's a really important thing. We don't build a relationship in one conversation or one short phone call. It takes several conversations, it's meetings, and we need to show trust through our actions. It's not what we just say, but how we follow through. And it doesn't always have to come in the form of just moving the grant. It's even offering up help and assistance and asking people, how are they doing? I don't ask that just for them to give me a standard answer. Like, I really want to know how they are doing, because without them, without their health, sustainability, we don't have a movement to move forward and fight all these issues. And so I do think we have to ground ourselves in transformational and not transactional relationships.
We need to also be sharing with our partners what we're grappling with. And I think that that's it. Not only are we showing up and allowing for that two-way conversation, but we're actually saying to them, okay, help me understand this better. This is what I'm struggling with. And that's exactly what the partners in Santa Ana did. You and I have joked about it, that I know now after 8 years of being in Santa Ana, that when I stepped into that community, a lot of the leaders and the organizers, they actually acknowledged that they organized me. And I thought they were just being super nice and just sharing things with me. But now in retrospect, I know that they were organizing me. And part of what that was me sharing with them, look, I want to be a better partner to you. I actually want to take what your experiences are in the community, in your everyday life, and I want that to help direct us and help us to do better in terms of us really understanding, again, this intersectionality that we're talking about with immigration, with criminal justice and criminal legal, with housing, with all of these different spaces. Help me understand that better. And they really did take me on that journey. And I'm thinking back what Sandy had said about abolish ICE. That's exactly what the immigrant youth leaders did with me. And it takes that kind of time, but it also required me to actually tell them, hey, look, please help me because I don't know how to tell this story. I don't know what to say about this. And I don't know how to frame this in a way that truly captures everything that you guys already know and are anticipating about this movement. I feel like that's a fundamental piece that we also need to kind of put aside this idea that we're just there to, listen to them, about their programs or about their strategies, but we also need to treat them like thought partners as well as we think about expanding and again, taking our foundation down that path of trust-based philanthropy.
One of the things that I would say is an important call to action that would be one step to getting us there is this need for proximity to movement. And I feel like one of the most concrete ways for us to get more proximate to movement is to really look at who is in philanthropy. What are the different backgrounds of people? What are the shared experiences that they may have with grantees? And it may not always be a movement person, but it may be someone that comes from the demographics and background of the people who we are supposedly intending to support. Even if that's not possible, then we have to work really hard to do that learning and to immerse ourselves. It can't be just a phone call. I really do believe people need to get on the ground and maybe have an immersive experience, seeing what is it like to knock doors in your neighborhood and to have those difficult conversations. What is it like to do some advocacy on a really hard issue? The more that you can put yourself in that place, the more you can empathize with where movement leaders are and the difficult choices and the obstacles they have to navigate while also dealing with their own trauma and their own experiences.
And I think that's one of the things the pandemic has really taught us is the need for us to be able to hold all of these things, again, because these are whole individuals, whole people and communities that are holding all of it. And we as funders don't get to pick and choose what part of that we should be funding. We really need to fund them as whole people in whole communities so that we could truly see the types of change that we want to see.
It is imperative that we have that relationship based on trust, trusting that we know what we are doing, trusting that our community know what they are doing. They've made their journey to make it here, and our goal is to really be on the journey with them moving forward. Again, because the majority of Black-led communities are small and due to lack of funding, we are forced to wear different hats. And we don't have a full department to do reporting. We don't have a full department to do grant writing. The same person who is doing the grant writing is going to do the reporting, is going to be doing the panels, is going to really be on the ground in Tijuana, in Del Rio, when something happens, to be able to answer to the needs of the community. And the funders understand that when we are dealing with grassroots organization, trust us to do the work, help us to provide the services, because we cannot do this by ourselves.
I think what's at stake if we don't make this shift is that then our communities will be limited. There will be less innovation. There will be less room to take risks. And it will decrease our opportunity to really empower folks who are coming into this work to be creative and imagine all the different possibilities. There's a big wave of community folks that have been brought into the movement under COVID. And there's just so much creativity and untapped power. And as we move towards a more trust-based philanthropy relationship, I do believe that this could open the possibilities in ways that I think we would have never imagined.
When Guerline referenced Emmett Till, in order for our stories to be believed, let them see. This was such a powerful statement. How unfair is that? In order for their stories to be believed, they have to show and relive the trauma what they as individuals and communities have to experience. How much in the world of philanthropy do we perpetuate that by asking our partners and communities to prove to us how horrible things are? and how much your need is worse off than this other community. What are we doing? How can we do this differently? This is the fundamental piece of trust-based philanthropy. And we leave you with that thought. How can you be a change agent within your organization?